Before we talk about love in Wuthering Heights, we need to confront a much more uncomfortable possibility. What if the real villain of the story is not a person at all? What if the force that destroys lives, distorts relationships, and echoes across generations is something so ordinary that most readers never notice it? For nearly 2 centuries, people have approached this novel as a tragic romance. A story of obsession. A story of passion. A story about 2 people who cannot find their way to each other. But what if that interpretation is only looking at the surface? What if the emotional chaos that defines the novel is not the cause of the tragedy, but the symptom? Because hidden beneath every relationship in Wuthering Heights is a question that feels surprisingly modern: who gets to belong? And that question matters more than it first appears. Think about it. In every society, there are visible forms of power: money, property, status, influence. We recognize those immediately. But there are also invisible forms of power. The kind that determine who is welcomed into a room, whose voice is respected, whose future seems possible, and whose existence feels like a problem waiting to be solved. That invisible power rarely announces itself. It doesn't need to. It lives in assumptions. It lives in expectations. It lives in the quiet belief that some people naturally fit, while others never truly will. And once that belief takes hold, something strange begins to happen. Human relationships stop being driven entirely by affection, trust, or loyalty. Instead, they become entangled with hierarchy. Love becomes a negotiation. Identity becomes a performance. Belonging becomes a prize. But here's the contradiction that sits at the heart of Wuthering Heights. The characters desperately seek connection, yet they inhabit a world structured around separation. They long for emotional freedom while living inside a social order that constantly reminds them where they stand. And that raises a disturbing question. If people are forced to choose between being accepted and being themselves, is that really a choice? This is where the novel becomes much larger than a single relationship. Look at the landscape that surrounds the story. The windswept house standing alone on the moors is more than a setting. It functions almost like a memory fragment carved into the reader's mind. A lonely structure exposed to endless storms, separated from comfort, separated from certainty, separated from the systems that promise safety. It becomes a symbol of a deeper reality. Isolation is not always physical. Sometimes it is social. Sometimes the locked door is invisible. Sometimes the wall is made of class. And once we see that, another mystery begins to emerge. Why do certain wounds in the novel seem impossible to heal? Why do conflicts refuse to stay contained within a single generation? Why does pain keep reproducing itself, long after the original injury should have faded away? The answer may have less to do with individual personalities than we think. Because when a society teaches people that their worth depends on their place in a hierarchy, rejection becomes more than rejection. It becomes a judgment about value itself. And when that happens, the consequences don't end with one person. They spread. Across families. Across generations. Across entire cultures. Which leads us to the question that makes Wuthering Heights feel so unsettlingly relevant today. What if the novel isn't asking whether love can survive social barriers? What if it's asking something far more dangerous? What if it's asking whether people can ever love freely in a world that constantly tells them what they are worth? If social hierarchy shapes human relationships, then we need to ask a more unsettling question: how does that power actually operate? Because most systems of control don't survive by using force alone. They survive when people begin carrying the system inside themselves. And that's where the central conflict becomes much darker. The world surrounding these characters is built on visible boundaries, property lines, family names, inheritance, reputation. But the most important boundary is invisible. It exists in the mind. It is the quiet internal map that tells people where they belong and, more importantly, where they do not. This is why the conflict in the novel is not simply between individuals. It is between human desire and social classification. Consider the role of Heathcliff. Not as a romantic figure. Not as a victim. Not even as an antagonist. Think of him as a disruption. A living contradiction. His very existence challenges the categories that organize the world around him. He occupies a position that the social order struggles to define. And whenever a system encounters something it cannot easily classify, it tends to respond in one of two ways: absorb it or reject it. The tragedy begins long before any personal decision. It begins the moment belonging becomes conditional. And this introduces a revelation that many readers miss. The deepest wounds in the story are not created by hatred. They are created by hierarchy. Hatred is obvious. People recognize it immediately. Hierarchy is different. Hierarchy can disguise itself as common sense, as tradition, as respectability, as the way things are. That is what makes it powerful. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because once people internalize those rules, they start policing themselves. They begin measuring their own worth against standards they never created. They begin making choices based not on what they want, but on what feels socially permissible. At first glance, that may sound like a problem confined to 19th century England. But scale the idea outward. How many modern relationships are influenced by income? By education? By social status? By the desire to appear successful? The technology has changed. The architecture of power often has not. That realization transforms one of the novel's most memorable memory fragments. The closed door. Not a physical door. A psychological one. A door separating acceptance from exclusion. Inside is legitimacy. Outside is uncertainty. And the terrifying part is that people can spend their entire lives trying to earn entry into a room that was never designed for them in the first place. This creates another contradiction. The pursuit of acceptance often promises freedom. Yet it frequently produces dependence. The desire to belong can become so powerful that people sacrifice authenticity to achieve it. And once that happens, identity itself begins to fracture. This helps explain why the emotional intensity of the novel feels so disproportionate to its circumstances. Beneath every conflict lies a larger struggle over value. Beneath every rejection lies a question about worth. Beneath every act of pride, resentment, longing, or self-protection lies the same hidden fear: what if I am not enough? Not enough to be welcomed. Not enough to be chosen. Not enough to matter. The consequence extends far beyond a single generation. When societies attach human value to hierarchy, emotional wounds become structural. They are passed down like inherited property. Not through blood alone, but through beliefs. Through expectations. Through stories people tell themselves about who deserves love and who does not. And this brings us closer to the mystery at the center of the novel. If hierarchy is the hidden force shaping these lives, then why do the characters continue participating in the very system that harms them? Why defend the rules that limit you? Why protect the structure that wounds you? And what if the most powerful form of control is not exclusion itself, but convincing people that exclusion is natural? Why would anyone defend a system that diminishes them? At first, the answer seems irrational. If a hierarchy causes suffering, exclusion, and resentment, why not reject it? Why not walk away from the rules entirely? But that question assumes something that may not be true. It assumes people fear oppression more than uncertainty. And that is where the deeper contradiction begins to emerge. Because throughout history, human beings have often tolerated unfair systems for one simple reason: those systems provide structure. They tell people where they stand. They create an order, even when that order is unequal. The alternative is ambiguity. And ambiguity can be terrifying. This helps explain one of the most important roles in the novel. Heathcliff is not merely an outsider trying to enter a social world. He represents something more disruptive. He is a challenge to the categories themselves. His presence raises a question the social order does not want to answer: what happens when a person cannot be neatly placed within the hierarchy? The system reacts defensively. Not necessarily because it is cruel, Because it is fragile. That is an important distinction. A confident system does not fear anomalies. A fragile one does. And suddenly the conflict becomes much larger than a personal struggle. We are no longer looking at one individual seeking acceptance. We are looking at an entire social structure attempting to protect its own legitimacy. This is the escalation hidden beneath the surface. The real battle is not between characters. The real battle is between identity and classification. Between human complexity and social simplicity. Between who people are and who the system needs them to be. That tension creates another paradox. The very people harmed by the hierarchy often become its strongest defenders. Why? Because the system does not only distribute power. It distributes meaning. It tells people what success looks like. What respectability looks like. What belonging looks like. Take those definitions away, and many people lose more than status. They lose orientation. They lose certainty. They lose the map they use to navigate the world. This is where another memory fragment emerges. A child standing between two worlds. Not fully accepted by either. Not fully recognized by either. Neither inside nor outside. That image survives because it reflects a universal fear. Not poverty. Not failure. Erasure. The fear that no social category has a place for you. And once that fear takes root, extraordinary things begin to happen. People start pursuing approval at the expense of authenticity. They start measuring themselves through external standards. They start confusing acceptance with self-worth. At that point, the hierarchy no longer needs walls. People build the walls themselves. This is the revelation slowly taking shape beneath the novel. The most powerful forms of control are often psychological before they become institutional. A society does not need to constantly enforce its values when individuals have already internalized them. The gatekeeper moves inside the mind. And the consequences extend far beyond one generation. Children inherit more than property. They inherit assumptions. They inherit expectations. They inherit invisible rules about who matters and who does not. Scale the pattern outward and it becomes impossible to ignore. Families pass it down. Communities reinforce it. Institutions formalize it. Civilizations normalize it. What begins as a personal wound eventually becomes a cultural inheritance. And that is why the emotional conflicts in the novel feel so large. They are carrying the weight of an entire worldview. But here is where the mystery deepens. If hierarchy is sustained through belief, then its greatest strength is not power. It is consent. Not necessarily conscious consent. Not enthusiastic consent. But the quiet acceptance that the rules are natural. That they have always existed. That they cannot be changed. And what if that assumption is the greatest illusion of all? What if the tragedy we are witnessing is not simply the result of exclusion? What if it is the result of people mistaking a human invention for an unchangeable law of reality? Because once that possibility enters the conversation, a far more dangerous question appears. Who benefits when people believe that their place in the hierarchy is their destiny? If people mistake a human invention for a law of nature, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly is the invention? What is the hidden mechanism operating beneath the emotional turmoil, beneath the social tension, beneath the visible conflicts that capture most readers' attention? The revelation begins when we stop looking at class as an economic category and start seeing it as a psychological technology. That shift changes everything. Because the deepest function of hierarchy is not distributing wealth. It is distributing identity. It tells people who they are allowed to become. It establishes invisible ceilings long before any physical barrier appears. This is why the central figures of the novel matter less as individuals and more as symbolic forces. Heathcliff functions as a living challenge to inherited definitions of worth. Catherine embodies a divided consciousness pulled between authenticity and legitimacy. Edgar represents stability, recognition, and the social order's promise of security. None of these roles are merely personal. They are expressions of competing visions of reality. And that leads to a deeper insight. The conflict is not ultimately about love versus status. It is about two incompatible ways of measuring human value. One system asks, who are you beneath social labels? The other asks, what position do you occupy within the structure? Most societies claim to value the first question. Most institutions quietly operate according to the second. This contradiction explains one of the novel's most powerful memory fragments, a house standing alone against the wind. Not simply a residence. A symbol. The structure survives because it resists the world around it, yet it is also shaped by the same forces it opposes. In the same way, human beings often believe they are acting freely while unconsciously adapting to pressures they cannot fully see. The revelation becomes even more unsettling when we scale outward. Every civilization develops stories that justify its hierarchy. Some appeal to bloodlines. Some appeal to wealth. Some appeal to education. Some appeal to merit. The language changes. The function remains remarkably consistent. The hierarchy survives because it convinces people that existing arrangements reflect natural reality rather than historical choices. Once that belief takes hold, inequality begins to feel inevitable. And when something feels inevitable, resistance starts to look irrational. That is the hidden consequence. People do not merely inherit social positions. They inherit assumptions about what is possible. They inherit expectations about what kind of future belongs to them. They inherit emotional boundaries long before they encounter material ones. This is why the novel continues to resonate. Not because modern audiences recognize its specific social structure, but because they recognize its psychological architecture. The details have changed. The underlying questions remain. Who feels entitled to take up space? Who feels worthy of acceptance? Who silently edits their ambitions before anyone else has a chance to reject them? Suddenly the story expands beyond one setting, one era, or one group of characters. It becomes a meditation on how civilizations reproduce themselves through belief. Through symbols. Through stories. Through invisible rules that become so familiar they disappear from view. And here the next layer of revelation begins to emerge. What if the most destructive consequence of hierarchy is not exclusion itself? What if its greatest achievement is convincing people to participate in their own limitation while believing they are exercising free choice? Because if that is true, then the real tragedy is not that some doors remain closed. The real tragedy is that many people eventually stop trying to open them. And if that is the case, then an even larger mystery appears before us. What happens when a person finally recognizes that the walls shaping their life were never as natural as they seemed? What happens when a person realizes that the walls shaping their life are not natural? Most stories would tell us that awareness leads to freedom. That once people see the system clearly, they can simply reject it and move on. But the deepest revelation hidden inside this novel points in a far more troubling direction. Awareness alone is not liberation. Because the true prison was never the hierarchy itself. The true prison was what the hierarchy transformed inside the human mind. This is the core revelation. The novel is not ultimately about exclusion. It is about distortion. A social system does not need to destroy people physically in order to leave permanent scars. It only needs to distort how they understand themselves, how they understand others, and how they understand what is possible. Suddenly the central figures appear in a different light. Heathcliff is no longer simply an outsider seeking recognition. He becomes evidence of what happens when identity is forced into permanent opposition with belonging. Catherine is no longer merely divided between competing loyalties. She embodies a deeper contradiction, the collision between authentic selfhood and socially rewarded selfhood. Edgar represents something equally important. Not oppression, but legitimacy. The promise that acceptance can be purchased through conformity to existing structures. Together, these forces create a system that traps everyone, including those who appear to benefit from it. And that is the insight many readers overlook. Hierarchies do not merely wound the excluded. They also limit the imagination of the included. The system narrows everyone's understanding of human value. Some people are denied entry. Others become guardians of rules they never truly chose. Everyone loses something. This is why one memory fragment becomes so powerful when viewed through this lens, the closed door. Earlier, it appeared to symbolize exclusion. Now its meaning changes. The door is not merely preventing someone from entering. It is preventing everyone on both sides from becoming fully human. The person outside cannot belong. The person inside cannot transcend the system that defines belonging. The barrier diminishes both. This revelation expands the entire story beyond class. It becomes a meditation on the nature of identity itself. Human beings constantly inherit categories: wealth and poverty, prestige and obscurity, success and failure, insider and outsider. Yet these categories are always incomplete. They simplify realities that are infinitely more complex. The tragedy emerges when people begin treating those categories as truth rather than approximation. Once that happens, relationships become transactional. Recognition becomes conditional. Self-worth becomes dependent upon external validation. And then something profound occurs. People stop asking who they are. They start asking who they are allowed to be. Scale this pattern outward and the implications become enormous. Entire societies can become organized around inherited assumptions about value. Entire generations can grow up believing that certain futures belong to certain people and not others. Entire civilizations can mistake social arrangements for moral truths. The novel's deepest warning is not directed at one historical period. It is directed at a recurring human tendency. The tendency to transform systems into destinies. To transform status into identity. To transform belonging into a measure of worth. And perhaps that is why the emotional force of the story endures. Beneath every conflict lies a question that remains painfully relevant today: what part of your identity is genuinely yours, and what part was constructed by the expectations surrounding you? Because if much of human suffering emerges from inherited definitions of value, then the consequences extend far beyond one novel, one century, or one society. They touch education, relationships, ambition, politics, and even the stories people tell themselves in private. Which leads to an even larger philosophical problem. If systems shape identity, and identity shapes behavior, then how many of the choices we call personal are actually echoes of structures we never consciously chose to inherit? If inherited systems shape identity, then we have arrived at the question of consequence. Not what happens during the conflict, but what remains after it. Not the storm itself, but the landscape it leaves behind. Because the most enduring effects of social hierarchies are rarely visible in the moment. They emerge slowly. They settle into habits, expectations, and emotional reflexes that can survive long after the original structure has weakened or disappeared. This is the legacy that the novel ultimately exposes. The deepest consequence is not exclusion. It is inheritance. Not merely the inheritance of property, status, or opportunity, but the inheritance of perception. People inherit ways of seeing themselves. They inherit assumptions about what they deserve. They inherit silent expectations about what kinds of futures are realistic and what kinds remain out of reach. Consider the memory fragment of the child standing between worlds. Earlier, it represented uncertainty. Now it represents transmission. The child becomes a vessel carrying forward beliefs that were never consciously chosen. This is how systems achieve longevity. They no longer require constant enforcement because they reproduce themselves through culture, through family, through memory. The result is a cycle that feels almost invisible. One generation experiences limitation. The next generation inherits caution. The following generation mistakes that caution for common sense. Eventually nobody remembers where the boundary came from. They only know that crossing it feels dangerous. That is a profound consequence because it transforms historical conditions into psychological realities. The original barrier may disappear. The emotional imprint remains. This is where the legacy of the central figures becomes larger than their individual roles. They cease to function as characters and begin to function as warnings. Not warnings about personal flaws, but warnings about what happens when human value becomes dependent upon external structures. Their influence extends beyond their own world because they reveal a pattern that repeats throughout history. Every society creates categories. Every society develops ways of ranking people. Every society produces insiders and outsiders. The specific labels change, but the underlying mechanism remains remarkably familiar. Scale the pattern outward and the implications become difficult to ignore. Educational systems can reinforce it. Economic systems can reinforce it. Cultural narratives can reinforce it. Even well-intentioned institutions can reinforce it. Not necessarily because they are malicious, but because systems often prioritize stability over complexity. Human beings are infinitely complex. Hierarchies prefer simplicity. There is the tension. There is the cost. Another memory fragment returns here with greater force, the solitary house standing against the wind. Earlier it symbolized isolation. Now it symbolizes endurance. The structure remains. The storms pass. Generations come and go. Yet the deeper questions persist. Who belongs? Who decides? Who benefits from those decisions? And perhaps most importantly, who learns to doubt their own worth because of them? That final question may be the novel's most lasting contribution. Its legacy is not confined to literature. It challenges viewers to recognize how often modern life still asks people to prove they deserve acceptance. Sometimes through achievement. Sometimes through appearance. Sometimes through status. Sometimes through success. The methods evolve. The pressure remains. And that creates a final paradox. Human beings crave belonging. Because belonging is essential to flourishing. Yet the pursuit of belonging can become dangerous when acceptance is conditioned upon conformity to artificial standards. The very thing that promises connection can quietly erode authenticity. That tension has not disappeared. If anything, it has become more sophisticated. Which leaves us with a mystery that extends far beyond the boundaries of any single story. If every generation inherits invisible ideas about value, worth, and belonging, then how can anyone know which parts of their identity are truly their own and which parts are simply echoes of systems that have been speaking through them all along? Perhaps the most enduring achievement of this novel is that it quietly shifts the question. At the beginning, it seems to ask who belongs. By the end, it asks something far more profound. Why do human beings need belonging to determine their value in the first place? That shift changes how we see everything that came before. The windswept house on the moor is no longer simply a place. It becomes a memory of isolation. The closed door is no longer simply a barrier. It becomes a symbol of every invisible boundary people carry within themselves. The child standing between worlds is no longer merely a figure trapped between categories. It becomes an image of the human condition itself. Because in one way or another, almost everyone spends part of life standing between worlds. Between who they are and who they think they should be. Between what they desire and what they believe is permitted. Between authenticity and acceptance. This is why the story continues to matter long after its historical setting has faded into the distance. Its deepest concern is not class alone. It is the universal human tendency to confuse recognition with worth. Throughout life, people are offered countless measurements of value. Wealth. Status. Achievement. Education. Influence. Reputation. Some are useful. Some are necessary. Yet all of them contain a hidden danger. The moment an external measure becomes the foundation of identity, the self becomes fragile. It begins to depend upon forces outside its control. And when that happens, even success can become a form of insecurity. This may be the final insight the novel leaves behind. The search for belonging is not the problem. Human beings need connection. They need community. they need recognition. The problem begins when belonging becomes conditional upon proving value according to standards created by systems rather than by humanity itself. At that point, acceptance stops being a relationship and becomes a transaction. The cost is often invisible at first. A compromise here. A silence there. A dream abandoned before it is fully formed. A part of oneself quietly edited away. Over time, those small adjustments accumulate. Eventually people may find themselves living lives that appear successful from the outside while feeling strangely disconnected from who they actually are. That possibility reaches far beyond the world of the novel. It touches modern workplaces, modern relationships, modern institutions, modern culture. The forms have changed. The underlying question remains remarkably familiar. What are people willing to sacrifice in exchange for acceptance? And what happens when the sacrifice becomes so gradual that they no longer notice it happening? The legacy of the story is not an answer. It is a lens. A way of looking at the invisible forces that shape identity, ambition, love, and self-worth. It reminds us that some of the most powerful structures in human life are not built from stone or law. They are built from assumptions. And assumptions are dangerous because they often become invisible precisely when they are most influential. In the end, perhaps the most haunting image is not the house, the door, or the storm. It is the possibility that entire generations can inherit ideas about value without ever questioning where those ideas came from. And if that is true, then the most important question may not be whether society has changed since the world of this novel. The more difficult question is whether we have learned to recognize the invisible hierarchies that still shape our understanding of ourselves. Because the story may be over, but the question remains. How much of what we call identity is genuinely our own, and how much is simply the echo of a door that was closed long before we arrived?